Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm breaking new ground on an old subject. The new ground is that for the first time on this podcast, I'm joined by two professors. One, Benjamin van Rooij, is making his third appearance on the show, while the other, Danny Sokol, is making his debut. They're both here together because they're the co-authors of a new book, which I know that many of you are going to want to read. That book is the Cambridge Handbook of Compliance. Now, if two professors talking about a compliance handbook sounds dull, then get ready to be surprised. And rest assured, I'm not in the business of making boring podcasts. This isn't just an episode for compliance officers, it's highly relevant to all of us. Thanks to the world's largest ever behavioural experiment, the one we've all been participating in under COVID, compliance is something that we're all aware of. And we're particularly aware when it's done badly because it feels at best clumsy and at worst incredibly annoying. So if you've wondered why certain attempts to influence our behaviour under COVID haven't worked and why others have been far more effective, then this book will help you understand why. As Danny and Benjamin explain in the introductory chapter to the book, you can download that for free. There's a link in the show notes. The handbook approaches compliance as the interaction between rules and behaviour. And if you start to look at it in those terms, then you can find new ways of solving the challenge of influencing human decision making. A perfect topic then for a podcast exploring human risk. When Benjamin, Danny and I sat down to record our discussion, we did it as a video, which we'll be releasing in shorter clips. But we also thought it would be a good idea to release the entire conversation as a podcast. So please enjoy my conversation with Professors Benjamin van Rooij and Danny Sokol on Compliance 2.0. Hello, my name's Christian Hunt, and I'm here with Benjamin van Rooij and Danny Sokol to talk about their new book. Before we get into that, I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. So Benjamin, can we start with you?
Yes, hi. My name is Benjamin van Rooij. I'm Professor of Law and Society at the University of Amsterdam School of Law. I'm also Global Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine.
And Danny?
I'm Danny Sokol. I'm a Professor of Law at the University of Florida. But very shortly, I will actually also be moving to California, where I will be Professor of Law at the University of Southern California and Affiliate Professor of Business also at USC.
Tell us a little bit about the book. What's the idea behind it?
So the idea behind the book is that there is a science to compliance. The idea is that somehow this field of compliance in academia and practice hasn't really been able to connect very well. So we have all these different scholars in different silos studying different aspects of compliance, sort of like blind men with an elephant, who don't really connect together. So we try to bring that together. And by doing that, we hope also that this field, the academic part of it, becomes more accessible to people in practice.
Danny, what are your aspirations for writing this book?
To me, the large problem was so many different people were trying to understand the same phenomenon of compliance, often from somewhat different perspectives, but speaking in effectively different languages, and not understanding that there are other people with similar interests that had actually done some significant work that might have aided them to really have a more integrated and nuanced approach. And what we had hoped to do was to bring together people with different perspectives in the hopes that by doing so, we could effectively create new approaches that were a little more tailored to reality, that took into account a number of different perspectives. And to the extent that compliance is in part about dealing with problems of organizational dysfunction, I'd say that the academic study is the paradigm of organizational dysfunction. So we needed to write a compliance book to have better compliance so that we could think about compliance.
And implicitly, you see that the way this is approached at the moment has some pitfalls. And Benjamin, I'm interested in your view. What are people getting wrong at the moment that they need a handbook to help them solve? Can you just give us some examples of the sorts of things you think are not being done effectively?
So I think the core thing is to which question we're asking. I think the question that a lot of people fail to ask is actually what drives compliant and non-compliant behavior. And I think that's what our book answers. Our book gives answers on the different mechanisms that shape compliance behavior. And it links that to the different interventions that we may have to link to those mechanisms. But I think most people are just thinking about the interventions. They're just thinking about, am I going to do more or less law enforcement? Am I going to do more or less compliance management code books or trainings? But that's sort of getting it the other way around. You actually have to start by understanding what drives it. And then you have to see with each intervention, how is that intervention tailored then to the behavioral mechanisms? And that's sort of the core of the book.
Obviously, there's some scientific insights here that you're bringing to this field. What do you think some of the key things that people ought to be aware of when we think about scientific insights that can help compliance?
Some of the insights actually are fairly obvious. And the reason I say this is because one thing that we tried to do in the book was have so many of these handbook chapters really focus on what do we know empirically. And some of the best studies are ones that basically tell us water is wet, or the equivalent in compliance. Like if you don't do anything, then you get behaviors that become increasingly non-compliant. But the reason why I think this matters is because so much of what we see in compliance, or in fact we don't see, are people who could make arguments when, let's say they have a supervisor say, why should I invest time, money, effort? And if you could go to them and say, there's an established body of literature that actually shows this is what you need to do and this is how you do it, I think that empowers compliance professionals.
So it is also about evidence. I think our book provides the evidence of different mechanisms.
One of the things that you highlight is that many of the traditional approaches to compliance don't work. And in order for it to be successful, we actually need to think counterintuitively. And I wonder if you could highlight some of the ways that you think counterintuitive thinking can help. What might surprise people when they read the book?
So I think the biggest bombshell in the book is that incentives don't work the way we think they do. So there is no conclusive evidence that simply installing a higher punishment will deter people from non-compliant behavior in of itself. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just means that it doesn't always happen when we do so. We even see that based on existing research, that instituting liability, tort liability, in of itself, there is not conclusive, clear, one-sided evidence that shows that even that prevents risk. So what the book really shows is the kind of traditional tools in law, which is the incentives. Of course, they're important, but we cannot assume beforehand that they work the way we think they do before we actually look at what they do. So the first, I would say, counterintuitive sense then is, okay, we must look beyond these incentives. And the book shows a lot of pathways to do so. It shows that we can really tap into social norms, so behavior of others or what we see others do. It shows how there's also a moral side to compliance. It shows that legitimacy of rules and rule systems are important. And maybe most surprising and most effective, it shows that the situation under which people operate, whether they get more opportunities to break rules or if they have more capacity to obey rules, actually is a major driver. And there's a lot to be done there. And in accountancy, you see that these insights have already been used in so-called hard controls. So you see that there, some of these fields, these insights already exist, and others they don't.
If I could just add one thing to Benjamin's comments, it's the following. One thing that people assume, particularly lawyers, is that somehow law is what's going to shape incentives, and law will somehow fix problems, right? Because when you say, if you don't do something, then the strong arm of the law is going to come and get you. And it turns out that's just not a full picture of what motivates behavior, that these informal norms and mechanisms actually matter a lot more than I think people have understood in the past. And perhaps this is exactly the opposite of what they learn when they're in uni, which is to say, they're taught that law matters, that you need to have a careful understanding of code or statute or some kind of case law. We're saying actually that matters much less than you might imagine, that these other factors matter more. And what's better, we've seen this in laboratory experiments, we've seen this empirically, we've seen this with all kinds of methodologies, whether or not it's behavioral psychology or experimental economics, or even finance or accounting or operations management or sociology, whatever the discipline, we actually have a nuanced understanding that really pushes back against a very simple idea that somehow formal law is what's going to shape behavior.
I think an important insight there is also we have a chapter about whether people know the law. And the bombshell is most people don't know the law. And it's not just that average people don't know criminal law or family law, no, also experts. So doctors don't know their doctor-client privilege rules. Educators don't know education law. And even if you look at lawyers, and there's no study reviewed there on lawyers knowing the law, but if you look, for instance, one of the bombshell things I saw in that chapter was US companies have to comply with several hundreds of thousands of rules that are backed by criminal sanctions. How could anybody know several hundred thousands of rules? So I think what's behind this is indeed, as Danny said, informal norms matter. The other part of it is it's sort of the perspective. And the perspective that lawyers have is ex post. If there's a dispute, or if you imagine there will be a dispute, we'll find the law, we'll find all the rules, and then the rules do matter, these formal rules. But what compliance is about ex ante. So you have rules before behavior where you try and drive behavior. And in that setting, it just doesn't work the way we're trained in law school. In law school, we're really trained how to deal with disputes, not really how to shape behavior. And I think that's a big insight that our book also covers and shows once you follow that perspective, what you get.
If I could just add one final thought to that, though we didn't identify it as such in the book, this is essentially compliance 2.0. Compliance 1.0 was here are the rules, follow the rules. Compliance 2.0 is really about shaping behavior before we even get to disputes, a sort of more modern way of thinking of law and its impact on the environment, whether or not it's a business environment or even, frankly, if you are dealing in a purely nonprofit setting, you also have very significant compliance motivations and opportunities. I'd say the same thing, even compliance within government as yet a third area.
There's a fascinating connection that is made implicitly in traditional approaches, which is that compliance and the law are the same thing. And that leads to a lot of lawyers being hired into compliance roles. And I wondered whether you thought that was actually effective. Should we be hiring lawyers with compliance, or is that unhelpful given the training that they've had?
I would say let's change the training that lawyers have. So I do think law plays a role. It's not that it doesn't play a role. There's a context to law. And law, I think if we retrain lawyers to not only know what the law is, but also how it works, they come to function much better, but also the laws they design and operate will be more behaviorally savvy. So I would say not only do we have compliance 2.0, we also argue for law school 2.0, where actually it's not just about understanding what the Supreme Court says about a dispute and what rules we can distill from that, but rather how does law actually get to behavior? How does the law work? I think there's so many legal jobs out there, both formally called compliance, but also many other jobs that involve human behavior. And lawyers are just not trained for this.
I'd like to think about it in a slightly different context. So a bit of my background is in the area of technology. And so I'll give you three different kinds of people, each with different backgrounds, and tell you how it is that we thought about it in the past, and which goes to the point of in today's world, each of these three different professional backgrounds need to know enough about the other background to be astute in terms of better understanding things. So Imagine we have a company. It's a technology-based company. The technology-based company lives or dies on if the technology works. So we can say that engineers really matter. So what do engineers do well? They ultimately plot out how to move from point A to point B to point C. That's the very traditional engineering approach, problem solving. Then all of a sudden we get to point C. And traditionally the lawyer looks at point C and says, oh, what's the legal precedent now that we're at point C? And then the business person who may be running the company looks at the lawyer and looks at the engineer and says, I don't care if this works and I don't care what the precedent is. How can I monetize this? And I think that gives you a sense of different backgrounds without any kind of nuance and understanding of what motivates any of these other roles and professions means that we get very narrow and compartmentalized thinking. And it strikes me that to answer your question of what are the right attributes of a compliance professional, best compliance professional may be an accountant, it may be a lawyer, it may be an MBA, it may be an engineer. But what they all need to have is a certain amount of legal astuteness to understand that there are laws and regulations, but they also have to think from a risk management perspective, right? You can't eliminate compliance risks. So it's how do we weigh the different factors for compliance given real institutional constraints in terms of the business and the business model, and real constraints with regards to what it is that we're doing. And in that sense, anybody could take on the compliance role. They just have to be very good at thinking outside the box and making these connections across different areas.
How do we measure success for a compliance function?
Well, that's another thing that the book is about. So it has several chapters about methods of actually assessing the impact of compliance. And here's the tricky part here. Here's the honest truth. Whatever approach we use, it comes with trade-offs. So, for instance, if you do ethnography, you get a really deep understanding of what really happens in a corporate context in practice. You can completely understand the processes, different actors involved, different rules involved, get a very fine-grained picture. So you capture the complexity and the reality. But it doesn't really generalize. You can't really predict what it does in other contexts. If you take the other end of that, you do big surveys, or you use governmental enforcement data. That gives you a broad context. You can have a big N number, you can have a big number, but to what extent is it truthful? So are people going to fill out a survey and really be truthful about their own behavior or the behavior of colleagues? So the book discusses these trade-offs. It discusses some techniques that are used to improve on each of these methods. But it also shows still the limits. So even in Compliance 2.0, one of the things that everybody needs to realize is that the knowledge and understanding we have of the impact will always be limited. So anybody telling you, oh, if you do A, will always work, that's not a believable product. And I think there's some people in practice, and maybe some academics as well, that sort of sell a quick fix. I think our insight in the book based on methods says, well, the quick fix is probably not something we can prove. And that's I would say the disappointing part, of course, where we are with the field, but it's the honest truth.
And so if you were talking to compliance professionals, one of the reasons that people cleave, I think, to traditional approaches is that it's demonstrable. It's very good from a defensive decision-making perspective. But actually, some of those things are least effective in terms of behaviors. I wondered how can people square the circle that they need to be able to show something to justify the expense, but equally, they need to be effective?
One aspect of why we have this disconnect is largely because of how organizations function, right? We have a balance sheet, and we say, if we're going to have a cost, at the same time, we want to have this measurable benefit. But maybe what we're measuring isn't quite right. It's not the actual quote unquote benefit, it's the cost avoided oftentimes. And that is actually very difficult to measure. And so another thing that the book identifies is the importance in some cases of getting buy-in from senior leadership to understand that the traditional approach doesn't work. Let me put it to you this way. The reason why most organizations have a traditional approach is because leadership is unwilling to try something different. They may not have the background, or they may not have the time, and they just do what people have done in the past because no one ever questions if you're doing what everybody else does. But the problem with that is that all sorts of compliance problems may grow largely because people have not accurately identified the risks and have not mitigated those risks early on when actually they were less costly rather than more costly.
I think the book is full of examples. So we have several chapters in the end that are case studies from different fields of compliance, different areas, such as, for instance, chapters that also Danny wrote on competition law and also AI. So I think that's also where you find for people in practice, once they've gone through the different perspectives and the different mechanisms and the methods, they can also find in the end of the book these case studies where they can actually see how is it done, what do we know about this, and what are good examples and what are maybe examples not to follow.
And just to follow up on what Benjamin says, when we say good examples, we don't literally mean examples that have oftentimes been effective. Many of the case studies across fields are really about failures. And that's also important to be able to identify what doesn't work.
You know, one of the things that's interesting is people tend to think traditionally of compliance as being very rigid. If you sort of ask people what's it about, it's about rules and regulations and sort of tight limits. And what you're suggesting with your approach contains implicitly a degree of experimentation, and that one ought to approach it much more like a discipline such as marketing would, where you see what works and adjust accordingly. But that isn't implicit in the traditional approaches. I wondered how, when we think about compliance 2.0, you can reflect on the nature of trial and error and experimentation and how that can help achieve the objectives you're talking about.
So I think to grow any organization requires innovation, or you're left behind. It's striking how, if that is true, and that seems to be true, right? Only the most innovative companies end up surviving long term, or other organizations, because they're able to adapt. It's striking to me how very conservative they are with their own compliance, even while they like to press the fact that they're an innovative company. So really, this is about aligning a company's or other form of organization's mission, saying that we're innovative, we can adapt, and saying, let's take that seriously and make the compliance function equally adaptive.
Yes, and I think it's also what people do you put in the compliance function. So going back to, if you have traditionally trained lawyers, they're not necessarily going to be the experimenters. I mean, maybe there's some that might, and I've met some that do, but I think if you set up groups within those teams that are more geared towards experimentation, that works better. So I've talked with one company in the Netherlands. They have a behavioral science group there, and they have started to do experiments. They wanted to get A, data, they wanted to understand what the situation was, and B, they wanted to understand what actually has impact. I know also at ComplianceNet, which is an organization where Danny and I are both active, where you get all the academics together, we've had practitioners for instance, of one major Wall Street bank. They have a whole behavioral economics unit that is doing experiments with this. And of course, in government, in UK, the Netherlands, we also have behavioral scientists on the regulatory side. So I think in part, it is about having these people that want to innovate, that can come internally from a company. I also see that government sometimes plays a role there. So I think some governments have stimulated more innovative forms of compliance. I mean, there's some good examples. I mean, one that we don't focus on in the book, but that I read about recently is Netflix. Their HR policy and compliance, I mean, there's a good Harvard Business Review paper on this. For instance, they have a very simple travel policy. I mean, I think it's 5 words. I don't know if I remember them correctly, but it's something like, don't do anything that hurts Netflix interests. And that's it. And for me, that was a striking example because it's sort of the opposite of what we see happens in most companies, which is they add rules, then there's more risk, they add more rules, there's more risk, they add more rules, and they sort of get into a spiral where there's less and less trust in employees, there's more rules, and because there's more rules, people have less trust in the business, and actually you need to keep more people in check. So I think those sorts of experiments, and I'm engaged in a similar experiment where we're trying to bring a anti-bribery policy from 30 pages to 1 page to kind of say, okay, what gets lost and what do we add when we do this? So this is also with a company that says, okay, let's experiment. Let's team up with people in science and see what we can design and see what actually are the effects. And I think that's the way to go.
And one of the challenges when people are trying to adopt the sort of approaches that you're recommending is, of course, that regulators are perceived not to encourage this behavior. Now, sometimes that is just a convenient excuse, but sometimes there is an element, based on what the regulators are saying, of validity to that statement. I wondered what you thought about that and what your message to regulators would be.
I would say our book is also aimed at regulators. So I work quite a lot with regulators in the Netherlands, and I see that they are very much interested in this compliance 2.0. They're also interested in what they might even see as compliance 3.0. So 2.0 might be, we get the mechanisms right, we get the behavior central. 3.0 is, okay, let's really make this ingrained in companies and culture. And you see that culture pops up a lot. But I see they don't really know what to do with these things. So they've hired some of the behavioral experts, but some of these are also very siloed. So they know 1 or 2 tricks on how to do things, but not the wide range. So I think more engagement with regulators, with the science, but also having a space for regulators and people in business to meet outside of their normal interactions, where we can maybe with academics together discuss, okay, what is the end goal? The end goal should be the same. It should be reduction of risk. And I think once we see that as the end goal, then we're in compliance 2.0 or regulation 2.0, then it becomes pragmatic. How do we get there? There's one big but here, which is the politics. So regulators are in a context where they have to show effect. And they're always thinking about, what if this major crisis happens and we're shown to have tried to understand the business rather than just crack down on it? And that's a context that's really important. That's one of the reasons that I've been trying, and also that Danny and I are trying, to also reach a more public domain. You do need to bring this conversation also into the mainstream political conversation. So, for instance, each time a major scandal happens, we need to push back a little bit on saying, let's find the highest CEO and hang them out to dry. That may feel good. It may sometimes be necessary, but very often it's not solving the problem. Sometimes it makes it even worse because everybody becomes extra defensive because we do that. And we don't really get to look, or let alone solve the underlying problems. So I think there's these different layers. The regulators themselves need to understand, but they need to have a political constituency that understands them.
I'll just add one more thing to the politics. On the one hand, government says, we would love to hear from industry. Please tell us what you think. And yet when you talk to industry or industry associations, oftentimes they're terrified to speak before government because they believe, largely because of prior government practice, that the more they talk, the more they open themselves to the possibility of investigation. And part of the politics is to have government officials say, we actually really want to hear from you, and we're not going to punish you for speaking.
So it's all about getting back to basics, I would say, on all levels. So to the board, you would really say, look, wouldn't it be great if we could prevent a massive scandal? To regulators, you would say, wouldn't it be great if we could prevent a massive damage? And to politics, the same. And I think once everybody says yes on that, then you can say, okay, what's the best, most efficient way to do so? But we have it backwards now. It's so much output focused. Within the business, it's sort of, what is the least we have to do to show regulators that we're okay? For regulators, it's what do we need to send, which signal do we need to send out in the world that we're doing enough? And everybody's a little bit scared in that way. And it means nobody wants to go ahead and be the one that does things differently. So I think Danny was really right in saying earlier, this is not a field that likes innovation. And there's a reason to it. It's not just that people aren't trained as innovators. It's also that the incentives towards innovation are really not there.
So I'm keen to understand who you've designed this book for. What's your target audience?
So this book, it started off, I think, and we came from different backgrounds to the same conclusion. It started off with a frustration I think we both had, that we both understand this field broadly, but we saw that it was very siloed and not accessible. So the final goal was to reach the practitioner audience. But as we went along, we saw, wow, academics also need it. Because in academia, also, we are not looking at each other's work. So in a way, the way I see the book is it's building a field that doesn't exist in science yet. There's not a journal. There's not one good book that gives an overview until we have this book, which is the field of compliance. So that's sort of, for me at least, the audiences. It's the academics bringing them together and towards practitioners.
I'll say the same thing in a slightly different context, building off what Benjamin said, that we had different approaches. So I think what brought us together was this idea that compliance mattered. So we looked at each other and said, yes. And then the next obvious question was, and now what? And what we recognized was what was missing, right? That people were speaking to only their small little compartmentalized groups of people that kind of thought the way they did, both in practice and in various academic communities. And so part of the purpose of the book was to build bridges across these different divides, and to do so in a way that really gave a significant evaluation to what do we know empirically, right? Because ultimately, everyone says, it's great that you have this wonderful idea. Can you prove it somehow? And we wanted to basically empower people in organizations, empower, whether it's government or business, to say, we do seem to know certainly what doesn't work. And in fact, we're seeing really interesting experiments of what might work if we can tailor it to our particular circumstances. And from the academic perspective, to understand, there are people that are studying very similar things, and you have no clue what they are doing. And this is the frustration, I think, of anyone who works in any large organization. You think that you're the only one tasked to do something, only to find out 6 months later there's a whole other unit basically replicating your work, but from a different perspective, and really not making more progress than you are, but who focused on different issues. And you say, oh my goodness, if we would have known about each other months ago, we could have been probably much further along in our thinking and actually being able to do something. And I think ultimately the book is an attempt to really bring these different communities together and provide some kind of cohesive and coherent framing of issues, taking stock of where we've been and opportunities going forward, both in terms of how we can implement and, frankly, the work that still needs to be done.
It's funny, though, when you mentioned this, Danny, we didn't look at each other. I mean, all of this started with Danny sending me an email. And actually, Danny had heard that I'd started Compliance Net. And Compliance Net is an organization of all different compliance scholars. And then he emailed me and he said, look, I'm thinking of doing a handbook on compliance. Have you considered doing one yourself? Because I don't want to have two at the same time. So him being a competition lawyer, he wanted to corner the whole market. So sort of we've started a cartel. So we had a back and forth by email. Then we had a phone call. We never met each other. And then we started this whole book. We didn't meet until several months later at the first Compliance Net conference at UC Irvine. So it was really funny how even within this world of compliance scholars, we didn't know each other. We didn't know each other's work. It's only that Danny reached out to across the aisle, so to speak, that we met each other. And I think that's also what you see in the DNA of the book. The chapters that really are about criminology, the criminological view on this, the sociological view on this, are really from my background. The chapters that are really the corporate view on this, the legal view on this is really from Danny's background. And then there's a whole bunch that we share. I think in that we've gotten a much broader view of the compliance field that any of us would have had on our own. But doing so, we have cornered the market, I think. And so maybe we get an antitrust investigation.
And I'm fascinated by the intersect between academia and practitioners. And it's very obvious when you articulate what you have articulated that there are clear strengths that both can bring to furthering this objective. But how do you see that going forward? What do you see academia adding, and how can that relationship be improved?
So I think one thing that academics really can benefit from is to see that there's so much knowledge in practice. So I think better engagement with practice, A, makes the research more valid for practice. B, gives I think, much deeper set of questions to academia. I think some of the academics that we do is highly theorized, highly abstract, and maybe doesn't link to the real world as much as we would want to. So I think that's one area. I think the other area also, again, to say on the academic side, we need to do much more to bring the knowledge together, to synthesize, as we've tried to do in this book, much more studies on multiple variables. Also, we need to make it accessible. A lot of this behind paywalls with jargon, etc. So I think that's really where a lot of this lies. As a final point, also for academia, we should also be humble. So some of the academics that is also in our book, that our book also critically assesses, some of the academics just it gives one cool finding, but there isn't enough work to replicate this. So some of the coolest stuff that you read about in a newspaper coming out of psychology or behavioral economics, over years you find that some of that stuff doesn't work. For instance, there's this famous study that if you have people sign an insurance form and sign first on the top that they're going to be honest, they're going to fill it out more honestly. Great study. It shows that insurance companies can save a lot of money. It might be important for any sort of compliance that has a form. What do we find now? It doesn't replicate. It took 10 years for the same scholars to do the same study again. Why don't we as academics say, okay, we have a cool finding, let's do 10 more studies. Let's expand this. And that's where the incentives on our side are wrong. The incentives are that we publish a cool study in the top journal and then get a newspaper report on it on how cool it is, and then we fly to the next thing. But that's not what practice needs. What practice needs, and I think academia as well, is to have the patience to then say, okay, cool, we have this finding. What does it mean? How does it work exactly? Under which conditions does and doesn't it work? How do we translate it to different areas? All of that we can do if we just take the patience to actually dig deeper on findings that really are interesting.
Basically, organizations are spending significant resources, both financial and in terms of time, on compliance. And people want some kind of payoff. But what oftentimes the organizations are not doing in the practice side is exactly what Benjamin talked about on the academic side. It's, well, this seems to work, so let's just do it. Why? Because it worked once, and therefore we're going to have a whole theory of compliance based on, one experience. Sometimes it's a bad experience. Oh my God, we were sued. We had a big settlement. Some mid-level executive went to jail, and they changed their entire compliance profile based on that. But oftentimes, organizations don't really think 5 years later, 10 years later. So what did we learn? And do some of these assumptions still hold? So if we think about what makes an organization innovative, it's its own research and development. So we traditionally measure that by how many patents do you have, right? How much technology have you commercialized? In the compliance setting, compliance R&D is a bit different. It's about thinking, what has worked in the past? Does that work beyond that narrow setting into new areas? And it requires resources from the organization to be able to say, let's actually sit and work through these assumptions as our organization grows and changes, and frankly, as the regulatory risks change, and to do these kinds of assessments. And so if Benjamin was talking about it from the academic side, the same is equally true in practice, that we really don't follow up as much as we need to.
I think here an interesting thing is, there may be, I mean, I've met companies and people in companies who say, look, we want to be a compliance leader. I think that's an interesting thing. Which companies do want to become compliance leaders? Which ones do actually, even before they get into a scandal, actually want to say, let's get a much better system. Let's experiment with this. Let's link up with people who have knowledge. I think that's what I've seen. So what I've seen so far is only after they hit a major scandal do they actually want to become that leader. But I think the best way forward is to say, no, we want to stay ahead of that and be that leader. And I think our book, it does offer insights on how to become that. It also gives evidence about how that would work and what it could also prevent from happening. So some of the things that don't work.
I've got to ask you both about the word compliance, because on the face of it, it's not a particularly helpful piece of branding. And I'm struck that perhaps we could do better. I wonder what you think.
Well, we have, I think, 16 chapters on different perspectives about compliance. Maybe the most critical chapter we have is compliance as management. And in that chapter, actually looks back onto the word, where did the word management come from, and actually links that back to management in plantations, in slaveholding plantations. So we have several quite critical chapters that actually ask, what is it really what we mean by compliance? How does the way we see compliance then also shape how we do compliance? I think compliance has different meanings. So for most, in practice, it sort of means a system in place to prevent liability risks, if I put it in a very blunt way. For me, or for us, as we write in the introduction, we take a very broad approach. It's the interaction between rules and behavior. So there is also work on compliance that's really about what rules are and how they work is shaped by the response to those rules. There's a whole body of work that calls itself compliance. It's not the core thing that we focus on, but for us, it's about that interaction between rules and behavior, not just legal rules in general. So I think that's more helpful. Is that better branding? No. Do we need a different word? I don't think so. I think compliance works okay. It's sort of neutral, a little bit technocratic, but I do think anybody working on or in compliance has to be clear what they mean. And I think one thing that the book really does that nobody else does, it says, look, we look at compliance in any shape or form where we have rules and behavior. So we have the full spectrum from where people in corporate world are to highly criminal behavior, to, for instance, a capital punishment and murder. We have taken that full spectrum because they're all about the same things. They're all about whether individuals or organizations engage in unwanted behavior and to what extent rules can help with that. And one of the things that I think we do different from others is, okay, let's take all that knowledge, including all the knowledge we have about crime. And why did we focus on the criminal knowledge? It's just so much better research than the corporate stuff. So there's just so much more evidence there because we've been investing so much in that. So I think that's sort of this broad approach is really what is behind our book.
One thing that I'll just add to that is historically, the areas where we've had a lot of public data, like traditional crime, is where we've seen a lot more thinking because there's just been a lot more research. I think this is changing. And I think this is changing largely because so many companies are going through digital transformations. And all of a sudden, they're accumulating a lot more data, and they're really thinking very carefully about what they might want to do with that data. What are the kind of questions that they want to ask to better measure things? So I'll give you one example of something that probably 10 years ago, no company could have done. I'll give you the example of one company that's done it and what this means for other companies. So many people use Uber. Before the pandemic, people were using it for rideshare tremendously. So during that pre-pandemic era, Uber would sometimes have problems where you would get dropped off at the wrong location. And what they wanted to understand better for what's a compliance failure was, do you apologize? If you do apologize, do you not just apologize, but do you give some kind of financial reward of, we're so sorry, here's, let's say, $50 or $100. So because it's such a large organization and they could, experiment across different cities for different kinds of problems, they were able to get really interesting data about what's the best way to deal with a compliance failure, right? And it turns out if you gave too much money, people actually became less invested in Uber and more likely to leave Uber. So what they were able to do is to figure out how to optimize the idea of apology for what was a compliance failure with some kind of "we're sorry" statement and some amount of money that really kept you thinking, you know what, Uber cares about me. And this work simply couldn't have been done 10 years ago because we didn't quite have that level of data. And I think more companies are doing that. And increasingly, when you have a happy story, like Uber, they're making this data public.
One of the challenges that compliance has is that it's often perceived as being a function that is there to guarantee 100% compliance. And we know, based on the number of rules that there are, that is a nice aspiration, but practically impossible for any company, I would suggest, to be 100% compliant. How do we deal with that challenge?
I think it starts also with even saying it may not even be a nice aspiration. I think we've gone way too far with the amount of rules that we have. So there's a large amount of what I call zombie rules that are sort of got on the books somehow and are no longer, have never lived or have died at some point. There's also rules that are sort of there, but if there is really compliance with it, because they're ill-designed, they really don't help much with the risk that they're supposed to protect, and only create a sort of formalism that's hurting both the business and not really doing much in terms of risk protection. So I think the first thing to really ask, and this is not just for governmental rules, it's also, or even more importantly, for internal rules in companies. The first thing to ask is, what are really the rules we should focus on? So all of this starts with a risk assessment. So going back to what Danny said earlier, you can't do this without a risk assessment, either on the corporate side or on the government side. The problem is that if you have an ex-ante perspective, it's great to do a risk assessment. Once something goes wrong and you look at it ex post, everybody's going to say, why didn't you focus on that? And the answer isn't, well, we can't focus on everything, isn't good enough. And that's where you get these weird things. I may have told you earlier, Christian, I forgot, that the University of California had an accident a couple of years ago in one of its laboratories, and they had a settlement after that. And part of the settlement was that everyone going into laboratories where they do experiments needs to be aware of dangerous substances. And they created a list of 200 dangerous substances, and they had 20 pages protocols for each substance. So everybody had to sign a 4,000-page list. That makes perfect sense for if anything goes wrong ever again, they can say, look, we informed everybody, it wasn't us, the University of California. It doesn't make any sense in terms of preventing risk, because people signing 4,000 pages of documents probably means that all they learned is, wow, this is so complex, I don't know anything. But what I see is that first logic probably overrides the second logic. So I think going back to what we talked about earlier, you need to get buy-in, not only within the company, but also with regulators and broader in the political sphere, that yes, if we really want to prevent risk, that means we need to deregulate and focus on the most important risks rather than on all risks. And I'm not sure we're there yet. I think that's a much broader conversation that we need to have. And it seems we're on the opposite end of the spectrum, where we're only adding rules for each new risk that we see.
So to close us out, Danny, I'm intrigued. What is your favorite or your least favorite rule that's out there?
For me, it's Sarbanes-Oxley. And there's a particular rule of CEO certification that you actually understand the financials that you're submitting. And this largely was a result of a series of accounting scandals in the early 2000s where CEOs was like, these were the finance guys. I didn't quite understand what's going on. And it turns out, to my knowledge, not a single company has ever been penalized for the CEO signing, and then all of a sudden people say, but there was a compliance problem. But simply the idea that a CEO has to certify on a regular basis actually changed behavior, I think, in a positive way. that CEOs said, wait a second, I'm on the hook. We need to make sure that we actually know what we're doing. Have I gotten sign off from our compliance people? Have I gotten sign off from our audit team? Have I gotten sign off from the general counsel? And it wasn't so much the signing that mattered, it's what the signing meant, that all of a sudden it caused a senior executive, in fact, the most important senior executive, to pause before signing and check in with the leadership team to make sure that, to the best of their knowledge, there was something called compliance. And by the way, this is not the only place in the US where that happens. We also see this within the Food and Drug Administration context, where CEOs also have to certify, and if not, there are criminal penalties. But the idea of simply having a CEO certify and therefore being held to their word, I think changed behavior in very significant ways, and really in a positive way.
Benjamin?
Yeah, there's so many to think of. So I have to say, I would go with one that is both my least favorite and my favorite in the last year, which is the social distancing rule. I would say in the history of humanity, we have never had such an impactful rule adopted on so many places on the earth at the same time, with so much initial compliance that we saw, for instance, that the price of a barrel of crude oil went negative, not only because of that, but partly because of that. It completely undermined our economies. Yet in the first months of the first wave, people complied with it. So my favorite part of it is it allows us for everybody to go through a behavioral change that goes against their deeply ingrained human needs. So everybody's gone through that. Everybody's gone through being forced to go into compliance with something that they don't like. It makes that all these mechanisms underlying compliance has become visible. We've seen attempts at enforcement, which weren't very successful, and by the way, in my own studies, are not significantly predicting compliance. We've seen calls for social norms. We've seen moral calls. We've seen legitimacy messages. We've seen opportunity sort of interventions. So I think it's a really good area for getting everybody to understand this complex thing called compliance in their own lives. That's why I like it. Why I dislike it is obviously by now we want to get rid of it. I mean, we want this pandemic to be over and obviously to go back to normal life. So I would say that little rule, I think, is an endless source of teachable moments, of several teachable moments.
Amazing. And finally, remind us what the book is called and where people can find it.
It's called the Cambridge Handbook of Compliance. They can find it at any big seller online, like Barnes & Noble's, Amazon. They can also find it at the Cambridge University Press website. There's also a digital version they can get a subscription to, or ask their library to get a subscription to. And they can find the introduction for free as a free access paper, open access paper on SSRN, and we can send you a link.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Benjamin and to Danny for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about the Cambridge Handbook of Compliance and to download the introductory chapter, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those there. You can also find links to Benjamin and Danny's areas of research by following the links to those in the show notes. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have still to leave a 5-star review for it, please do on whichever platform you use. It really does help. Do visit human-risk.com for more information about the work that I do with clients to help them mitigate their human risk, and to get details of the Human Risk newsletter, video channel, and other resources to help you manage human risk in your organization. I'll be back with another episode very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe, be compliant, and thanks for listening.